Homeless veteran saves choking CEO in restaurant. Next day's events stun the nation. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the heart of New York City, where power and wealth collide under the shimmering lights, a moment of life and death unfolds in the most unexpected place. Peter Caldwell, a CEO who built his empire on the backs of others, is surrounded by luxury. Yet, in the blink of an eye, his life is hanging by a thread. He gasps for air, choking as the world around him freezes. Just when all hope seems lost, an unlikely hero steps forward from the shadows. A man whose own life has been ravaged by war and age. What happens next will not only change both of their lives forever, but will also expose truths buried deep beneath the surface. Two men, from two different worlds, brought together by fate. But this moment is only the beginning. The real shock? That's still to come. The luxurious Le Bernardin restaurant in Midtown Manhattan buzzed with the quiet chatter of New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white-clothed tables, where the city's most influential figures dined on exquisite French cuisine. At one of these tables sat Peter Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Industries, celebrating yet another corporate victory with his executive team. Peter, a silver-haired man in his late 50s, exuded confidence as he raised his glass of 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild. To another billion-dollar quarter, he toasted, his piercing blue eyes scanning the faces of his sycophantic underlings. They clinked glasses, the sound mingling with the soft jazz playing in the background. Outside, the November rain fell in sheets, turning the city streets into a glistening mirror of neon lights. Huddled in the doorway of a closed boutique across the street, Daniel Matthews watched the comings and goings of the restaurant patrons. His weathered face, etched with the lines of a hard life, contrasted sharply with the polished appearances of those entering the establishment. Daniel, a 45-year-old veteran of the Afghanistan War, pulled his tattered army jacket tighter around his body. The smell of gourmet food wafting from the restaurant's vents made his stomach growl painfully. It had been days since his last proper meal. He closed his eyes, memories of hot chow in the mess hall flashing through his mind. A stark reminder of a life that now seemed a lifetime away. Back inside, Peter was regaling his team with the story of his latest business coup. And then I told the board, "Gentlemen, it's not about the money, it's about sending a message." Laughter erupted from the table as Peter took another bite of his perfectly cooked filet mignon. Suddenly, Peter's face contorted. His hand flew to his throat, eyes widening in panic. The laughter at the table died instantly, replaced by confused murmurs. "Mr. Caldwell?" his CFO asked, concern etching her features. Peter tried to speak, but no words came out. His face began to turn an alarming shade of red. Realization dawned on the faces around him. He was choking. "Oh my God, he's choking!" someone shouted. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners stood up, craning their necks to see what was happening. Waiters rushed over, but stood helplessly, unsure of what to do. "Does anyone know the Heimlich?" a panicked voice called out. But in that moment of crisis, everyone seemed frozen, paralyzed by the shocking turn of events. Outside, Daniel's soldier instincts kicked in at the sound of commotion. He peered through the restaurant's large windows, immediately spotting the source of the disturbance. Without hesitation, he sprinted across the street, bursting through the restaurant's doors. Patrons gasped as the disheveled man pushed past them. Some clutched their purses tighter, assuming he was there to rob the place. But Daniel's eyes were fixed on Peter, who was now turning blue, desperately clawing at his own throat. In 3 long strides, Daniel reached Peter. "I've got this," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to life-or-death situations. He positioned himself behind Peter, wrapped his arms around the CEO's midsection, and began the Heimlich maneuver. 1 thrust, 2 thrusts. The restaurant had gone deathly quiet, the only sound the desperate gasps of Peter Caldwell. On the 3rd thrust, a piece of steak flew from Peter's mouth, landing with a wet thud on the pristine white tablecloth. Peter doubled over, gulping in huge breaths of air. Color slowly returned to his face as he steadied himself against the table. The restaurant erupted in relieved applause and cheers. As the initial shock subsided, Peter turned to face his savior. For a moment, their eyes locked. Deep blue meeting weathered brown. In that fleeting instant, a connection formed between two men from vastly different worlds. Peter saw years of hardship etched into every line of Daniel's face, while Daniel glimpsed a flash of vulnerability in the eyes of a man who seemed to have everything. The moment passed quickly, replaced by an awkward tension. Peter, still catching his breath, reached for his wallet. I can't thank you enough," he stammered, pulling out a wad of $100 bills. "Please, take this. It's the least I can do." Daniel looked at the money, then back at Peter. A sad smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Keep it," he said softly. "I didn't do it for money." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Peter staring after him, the cash still in his outstretched hand. As Daniel disappeared into the rainy night, whispers began to circulate among the diners. Who was that mysterious homeless man? Why did he refuse the money? Peter Caldwell stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling from the near-death experience and the enigma of his rescuer. Outside, Daniel melted back into the shadows of the city, just another invisible face in the crowd. But for Peter Caldwell, the night's events had shaken his world to its core. As he sat back down, his team fussing over him, he couldn't shake the image of those haunted eyes that had looked into his soul. Little did either man know that this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change their lives forever, but would soon captivate the entire nation. The morning after the restaurant incident, Peter Caldwell sat in his penthouse office atop the gleaming Caldwell Industries tower, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a surreal movie. He absent-mindedly rubbed his throat, still sore from his near-death experience. The face of his rescuer haunted him, those eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of pain and wisdom. Peter couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter was more than just chance. "Mr. Caldwell?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your security team is here." "Send them in," Peter replied, turning from the window. Two men in crisp suits entered, tablets in hand. "Sir, we've compiled the information you requested on the man from last night." Peter leaned forward, his usually steely gaze softened by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Tell me everything." As the security team began their report, the scene shifted to the gritty streets of Lower Manhattan. Daniel Matthews walked along the crowded sidewalk, invisible to the rushing masses around him. His stomach growled, reminding him it had been nearly 2 days since his last meal. He paused in front of a bakery, the scent of fresh bread tormenting him. Through the window he caught his reflection, a ghost of the man he once was. The sight triggered a flood of memories. Flashback: Daniel in full military dress receiving a medal for valor, his wife and young daughter beaming with pride. The happy image dissolved, replaced by scenes of horror, explosions, gunfire, the agonized cries of his fellow soldiers. Daniel shook his head, trying to dispel the demons that constantly plagued him. He continued walking, each step a battle against the weight of his past. Back in Peter's office, the CEO listened intently as his security team revealed Daniel's identity. "Daniel Matthews, sir, 45 years old, former Army Ranger, highly decorated, multiple tours in Afghanistan." Peter's brow furrowed. And now he's homeless? How does a war hero end up on the streets? The security officer hesitated. "It's a common story, sir. PTSD, difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. He lost his family, his home, everything." Peter stood abruptly, startling his team. "Find him. I want to offer him a job." "Sir?" The security officer looked confused. "Are you sure that's wise?" Peter's eyes flashed with determination. "That man saved my life. The least I can do is offer him a chance to rebuild his." As Peter's team scrambled to locate Daniel, the veteran found himself in a familiar alley, huddled against the cold. He pulled out a worn photograph, a smiling woman and a little girl with pigtails. Tears welled in his eyes as he traced their faces with a trembling finger. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't be the man you needed me to be." The sound of approaching footsteps made Daniel quickly tuck the photo away. He looked up to see two men in suits standing over him, "Mr. Matthews?" one of them said. "Peter Caldwell would like to speak with you." Daniel's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why?" "He has a proposition for you, sir. A job offer." Daniel laughed bitterly. "A job? Look at me, I'm not exactly executive material." The man extended his hand. "Mr. Caldwell insists on meeting you personally. Please come with us." Daniel hesitated, years of instinct telling him not to trust. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered of hope. A chance, perhaps, to reclaim some semblance of his former life. With a deep breath, Daniel took the offered hand and stood. As they led him to a waiting car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than a simple job offer. Meanwhile, in his office, Peter paced nervously. He had built an empire, faced down corporate raiders, and navigated economic crises. Yet the prospect of meeting this homeless veteran filled him with an anxiety he couldn't explain. As Daniel was escorted into the opulent lobby of Caldwell Industries, the contrast between his worn appearance and the sleek, modern surroundings couldn't have been starker. Employees stared openly, whispering among themselves. In the elevator riding up to the top floor, Daniel's mind raced. What could this wealthy CEO possibly want from him? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that this meeting would change everything? The elevator doors opened, revealing Peter Caldwell waiting in the hallway. Their eyes met once again, and in that moment, both men sensed that their lives were about to become inextricably linked. What neither of them knew was that forces were already in motion, forces that would test their newfound connection, expose long-buried secrets, and ultimately lead to a reckoning that would captivate the entire nation. As Daniel stepped out of the elevator, the stage was set for a story of redemption, moral choices, and the unexpected bonds that can form between the most unlikely of individuals. The tension in Peter Caldwell's office was palpable as Daniel Matthews stood awkwardly in his tattered clothes, a stark contrast to the sleek, modern de Plencourt. Peter gestured to a plush leather chair. "Please sit down, Mr. Matthews," Peter said, his voice softer than usual. Daniel hesitated before lowering himself onto the edge of the seat, his posture rigid. "Why am I here, Mr. Caldwell?" Peter leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "I want to thank you properly for saving my life, and I'd like to offer you a job." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "A job? Doing what exactly?" "Security consultant," Peter replied. "Your military experience would be invaluable to my company." As Peter outlined the position, Daniel's mind wandered, memories flooding back unbidden. Flashback. A dusty road in Afghanistan. Daniel in full combat gear leading his squad. Suddenly an explosion. Screams. Blood. Daniel frantically trying to save his men as chaos erupted around him. "Mr. Matthews?" Peter's voice snapped Daniel back to the present. "Are you all right?" Daniel blinked, realizing his hands were shaking. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this kind of work anymore." Peter's expression softened. "I understand you've been through a lot, but everyone deserves a second chance." As they continued talking, neither man noticed the television playing silently in the corner of the office. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom. Investigation into Veterans Support Fund scandal deepens. Meanwhile, across town, investigative journalist Sarah Chen sat in a dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of documents. Her eyes widened as she pieced together a trail of financial transactions. "Oh my God," she whispered, "it goes all the way to the top." Back in Peter's office, Daniel was beginning to warm up to the idea of the job. It had been so long since anyone had shown faith in him. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Caldwell," Daniel said. "But why me? You don't even know me." Peter stood, walking to the window. "Let's just say I believe in karma. You saved my life. Now I want to help save yours." As Daniel considered the offer, Peter's assistant burst into the office looking flustered. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see right away." Peter excused himself, stepping out of the office. In the hallway, his assistant showed him a tablet with breaking news. Peter's face paled as he read the headline. CEO Peter Caldwell implicated in Veterans Support Fund embezzlement scheme. Inside the office, Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. He approached Peter's desk, noticing a folder labeled Project Phoenix. As he flipped it open, his blood ran cold. There, in black and white, were documents detailing the systematic dismantling of veterans' support programs, including the very one that could have saved Daniel from homelessness years ago. And at the bottom of each document was Peter Caldwell's signature. Daniel's hands trembled with rage and disbelief. The man who had just offered him salvation was the same one responsible for destroying the lives of countless veterans like him. As Peter re-entered the office, he found Daniel standing by his desk, the incriminating folder in his hands. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both men realized that everything had changed. "You," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was you all along." Peter raised his hands, his face a mask of guilt and fear. "Daniel, I can explain." But before he could finish, Daniel's military training kicked in. In one fluid motion, he vaulted over the desk, tackling Peter to the ground. Security alarms blared as the two men grappled, years of pent-up rage and desperation fueling Daniel's actions. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniel shouted, pinning Peter to the floor. "How many lives you've ruined?" As security guards burst into the office, Daniel found himself once again staring into Peter's eyes. But this time, instead of gratitude, he saw only the cold calculation of a man who had built an empire on the backs of those who had sacrificed everything for their country. In that moment, Daniel realized that his true mission, the reason fate had brought him to this place, was far greater than accepting a job offer. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. As the guards pulled Daniel off Peter, the CEO straightened his tie, his mask of composure back in place. But the damage was done. The truth was out, and both men knew that their lives would never be the same. Outside the Caldwell Industries tower, reporters were already gathering, hungry for details of the emerging scandal. And somewhere in the city, Sarah Chen was preparing to blow the story wide open, unaware that the chance encounter between a homeless veteran and a corrupt CEO was about to become the catalyst for a national reckoning. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of redemption, justice, and the human spirit. And at the center of it all, two men from vastly different worlds, now inextricably bound by the weight of their choices and the echoes of their past. The aftermath of Daniel's confrontation with Peter Caldwell sent shockwaves through Caldwell Industries. Despite the tumultuous revelation, Peter managed to spin the situation, portraying Daniel's outburst as the actions of a troubled veteran. In a surprising move that left the media buzzing, Peter publicly announced his decision to not press charges and instead reaffirmed his job offer to Daniel, framing it as an act of compassion. 2 weeks later, Daniel found himself sitting in a sterile conference room surrounded by lawyers and PR representatives. The air was thick with tension as he signed a non-disclosure agreement, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. "Remember, Mr. Matthews," a sleek corporate lawyer said, sliding the papers across the table, "this agreement ensures your silence on all matters relating to Mr. Caldwell and the company. Any breach will result in severe legal consequences." Daniel's hand hesitated over the document, his conscience waging war with his desperation. The memory of sleeping on cold concrete warred with the faces of his fellow veterans who had been wronged by Caldwell's actions. "You're doing the right thing, Daniel," Peter said softly from the head of the table. "This is a chance for both of us to move forward, to make amends." With a heavy heart, Daniel signed the papers. As he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was selling a piece of his soul. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel was given a corporate makeover, new clothes, a fresh haircut, and a crash course in corporate etiquette. The transformation was startling. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. On his first official day, Daniel was escorted to his new office on the 40th floor. The view of Manhattan was breathtaking, a far cry from the streets he had called home for so long. But as he sat at his expansive desk, he felt more trapped than ever. Weeks passed, and Daniel found himself drowning in a sea of corporate jargon and political maneuvering. He watched as decisions were made that prioritized profit over people, each one a painful reminder of the world he had reluctantly entered. One evening, as most employees had gone home, Daniel was working late, poring over security reports. A notification popped up on his computer, an email accidentally sent to the entire company instead of a select few. His blood ran cold as he read its contents. The email detailed plans for a massive layoff, targeting primarily departments that employed veterans through Caldwell's much-publicized Second Chance program, the very initiative Daniel had become the unwitting face of. Bile rose in Daniel's throat as he realized the full extent of the deception. The job offer, the public show of support, it had all been a carefully orchestrated PR stunt, and he had played right into their hands. As Daniel sat there, the weight of his silence crushing him, he heard a commotion from Peter's office down the hall. Creeping closer, he overheard a heated conversation between Peter and Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist who had been digging into Caldwell Industries. "You can't bury this, Caldwell." Sarah's voice was sharp. "The public deserves to know the truth." Peter's reply was cool and collected. "Ms. Chen, I'd be careful if I were you. Accusations without proof can be dangerous." Daniel's heart raced. Here was someone fighting for the truth, for justice, and he was standing by, complicit in his silence. As Sarah stormed out of Peter's office, she locked eyes with Daniel. In that brief moment, he saw a flicker of recognition and hope. Back in his office, Daniel's gaze fell on a framed photo on his desk, a PR shot of him shaking hands with Peter, both smiling for the cameras. The image made him sick. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and pulled up Sarah Chen's contact information. His thumb hovered over the call button as the gravity of his decision weighed on him. If he made this call, he would be violating his NDA. He would lose everything he had gained, the job, the stability, the chance at a normal life. But if he stayed silent, he would be betraying everything he had ever fought for. In that moment, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success, Daniel Matthews faced the most important decision of his life. The choice between comfort and conscience, between self-preservation and sacrifice. As he stared at the phone, the faces of his fellow veterans flashed before his eyes. Those who had been cast aside, forgotten by the very system that promised to support them. He thought of the young soldiers he had led in Afghanistan, the promises he had made to always have their backs. With a deep breath, Daniel pressed the call button. As the phone began to ring, he knew there was no turning back. The price of his silence had become too high to bear. Across the city, Sarah Chen's phone lit up with an unknown number. As she answered, she had no idea that this call would be the key to unlocking a story that would shake the nation to its core. The stage was set for a battle between truth and power, with Daniel caught in the crossfire. As night fell over New York City, the pieces were in motion for a confrontation that would test the limits of loyalty, redemption, and the human spirit. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Peter Caldwell's corner office as he stood, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the New York skyline. The city was just waking up, but Peter had been there all night, his mind racing with the implications of what was about to unfold. A soft knock on the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he said, his voice betraying a weariness that went beyond mere lack of sleep. Daniel Matthews entered, his face a mask of determination. Gone was the uncertainty of the past weeks, replaced by a resolve that reminded Peter of the man who had saved his life that fateful night at Le Bernardin. "Mr. Caldwell," Daniel began, his voice steady, "we need to talk." Peter turned, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose we do, Daniel. I've been expecting this conversation." The two men stood facing each other, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy between them. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I know about the layoffs," he started. "I know about the veterans being targeted, and I know about your conversation with Sarah Chen." Peter's eyes widened slightly, but he remained composed. "I see. And what do you intend to do with this information?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "I came here to confront you, to demand answers, but more than that, I came to tell you that I can't be part of this anymore. I won't be your puppet, your PR stunt to cover up what you've done." As Daniel spoke, his voice rose with emotion. "Do you have any idea what it's like out there for veterans? The struggles we face? The system that's supposed to support us is broken, and you've been profiting from our pain." Peter listened, his face a mixture of guilt and something else. Was it relief? He walked to his desk and pressed a button on his intercom. "Sandra, hold all my calls and cancel my meetings for the day." Turning back to Daniel, Peter's demeanor changed. The corporate mask slipped away, revealing a vulnerability that caught Daniel off guard. "You're right, Daniel," Peter said softly, "about everything. And it's time I faced the consequences of my actions." What happened next stunned Daniel to his core. Peter reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the desk between them. "This contains every document, every email, every piece of evidence detailing the corruption within Caldwell Industries, including my own involvement." Peter's voice cracked slightly. "I've been compiling it for months, trying to find the courage to do the right thing." Daniel stared at the folder, then back at Peter, disbelief etched across his face. "I don't understand. Why would you?" Peter sank into his chair, suddenly looking every bit his age. "The night you saved my life, something changed. For years I've been building this empire, convincing myself that the end justified the means. But seeing you, understanding the impact of my decisions, it forced me to confront the truth." Tears welled in Peter's eyes as he continued. "I've spent sleepless nights thinking about all the lives I've ruined, all the veterans I've failed. I wanted to make it right, but I was a coward, too afraid to lose everything I'd built." Daniel stood frozen, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. The man he had come to confront, the villain in his story, was crumbling before his eyes. "So what now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter stood, his decision made. "Now we tell the truth, all of it, to Sarah Chen, to the authorities, to everyone. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions." As if on cue, the office door burst open. Sarah Chen strode in, flanked by 2 FBI agents. "Peter Caldwell," one of the agents announced, "we have a warrant for your arrest." Peter nodded, a mix of fear and relief washing over his face. As the agents began to read him his rights, he turned to Daniel one last time. "I know it doesn't make up for what I've done," Peter said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I hope this is a start. Use that folder, Daniel. Make sure the truth comes out. Help those who I've hurt." As Peter was led away in handcuffs, Daniel stood in the middle of the opulent office, the folder of evidence in his hands, feeling as though the world had tilted on its axis. The man he had come to hate, to blame for so much suffering, had just sacrificed everything in an act of redemption. Sarah Chen approached Daniel, her eyes gleaming with the promise of the biggest story of her career. "Are you ready to talk, Mr. Matthews?" Daniel looked down at the folder, then out at the city beyond. In that moment, he realized that his journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. With a deep breath, Daniel turned to Sarah. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with newfound purpose. "It's time the world knew the truth." As they left the office together, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this twist of fate was just the first in a series of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless veterans across the nation. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. The stage was set for a story of redemption, justice, and the profound impact of unexpected alliances. As news of Peter Caldwell's arrest began to spread, the nation held its breath, unaware that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The neon lights of Times Square blazed against the night sky as Daniel Matthews wandered aimlessly through the bustling streets of New York City. The events of the day played on repeat in his mind. Peter's confession, the FBI arrest, the damning folder now safely in the hands of Sarah Chen. He should have felt victorious, but instead, a storm of conflicting emotions raged within him. As he passed the electronics store, Daniel caught sight of his own face on the dozen TV screens in the window. The ticker at the bottom read, "Breaking news, Caldwell Industries, CEO arrested, whistleblower veteran speaks out." He quickly ducked his head and moved on. Uncomfortable with his newfound notoriety, the city pulsed around him, oblivious to his inner turmoil. Daniel found himself in front of the New York Public Library, its majestic stone lions standing guard in the night. He sat on the steps, his mind drifting back to another time, another place. Flashback, a dusty road in Kandahar province. Daniel, in full combat gear, kneeling beside a wounded comrade. "Stay with me, Johnson. That's an order." The sound of gunfire in the distance, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Daniel shook his head, trying to dispel the memory. He pulled out his phone, staring at the dozens of missed calls and messages. Reporters, talk show hosts, even politicians, all wanting a piece of the story, of him. He switched it off, craving silence. As he sat there, a figure approached, hunched against the cold. Daniel tensed, old instincts kicking in until he recognized the face of an old army buddy, Mike Ramirez. "Danny, holy shit, is that you?" Mike's eyes were wide with disbelief. Daniel stood, emotions welling up as he embraced his old friend. "Mike, what are you doing here?" Mike's smile faded as he gestured to a worn duffel bag at his feet. "Same as you were, I guess. Streets are home now." The two men found a quiet diner, the kind that never closes and doesn't ask questions. Over coffee that tasted like motor oil, they shared their stories. Mike had struggled with PTSD, lost his job, his family. The system that was supposed to help had failed him, just as it had failed Daniel. "But now you're some big shot, huh?" Mike said, nodding towards a newspaper on a nearby table, Daniel's face on the front page. "Taking down the man and all that." Daniel stared into his coffee cup, shame washing over him. "I'm no hero, Mike. I took their money, their job. I was silent for too long." Mike leaned forward, his voice low. "But you spoke up in the end, Danny. That's what matters." As they talked, Daniel's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it. Sarah Chen was calling again, probably with updates on the story that was about to break wide open. Daniel felt torn. Part of him wanted to dive headfirst into the fight, to use this platform to effect real change for veterans like Mike. But another part yearned for anonymity, to disappear and leave the painful past behind. "What are you going to do now?" Mike asked, sensing his friend's conflict. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I have all this information, this power to make a difference, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to do it." As dawn began to break over the city, Daniel and Mike parted ways, promises to stay in touch hanging in the air. Daniel found himself drawn to the East River, watching the early morning light dance on the water. He thought about Peter Caldwell, probably sitting in a cell right now. The man had done terrible things, but his final act of confession had been brave. Could people truly change? Could he? Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Matthews, this is Senator Emilia Cortez. I've been following your story. I believe together we can make real changes for our veterans. Please call me." The weight of responsibility settled on Daniel's shoulders. He had started this and now he had to see it through. But the path forward was far from clear. As the sun rose over New York City, Daniel Matthews stood at a crossroads. Behind him lay a past filled with pain and betrayal. Ahead, an uncertain future that held both the promise of redemption and the risk of further disillusionment. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the dog tag still hanging around his neck. In that moment, he made his decision. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Mike and countless others like him. It was about keeping the promise he'd made to his fallen comrades in those dusty, dangerous streets half a world away. With renewed determination, Daniel dialed Sarah Chen's number. As it rang, he steeled himself for the battle ahead. The war might be over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. The city awakened around him, unaware that the choices made by this one man in the coming days would send shockwaves through the corridors of power and spark a national conversation about honor, duty, and the true cost of war. The fluorescent lights of the Senate hearing room buzzed overhead as Daniel Matthews sat at the witness table, a sea of stern faces staring back at him from the raised dais. Senator Emilia Cortez, a formidable woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Mr. Matthews," she began, her voice echoing in the packed chamber. "You've brought us some truly disturbing information about Caldwell Industries and their treatment of veterans. But I must ask, how deep does this corruption go?" Daniel took a deep breath, acutely aware of the cameras trained on him, broadcasting this moment to millions across the nation. "Senator, what I'm about to reveal goes far beyond Caldwell Industries. This is just the tip of the iceberg." A murmur rippled through the room as Daniel reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder, the one Peter Caldwell had given him that fateful day in his office. As he opened it, his hands trembled slightly. the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. The documents in this folder implicate not just Caldwell Industries, but a network of corporations, politicians, and even high-ranking military officials in a conspiracy that has been exploiting and neglecting veterans for years. The room erupted in gasps and furious whispers. Senator Cortez's eyes widened as she leaned in closer. "Mr. Matthews, these are extremely serious allegations. Are you prepared to name names?" Daniel's throat went dry as he nodded. "I am, Senator. But before I do, I need to make something clear. This goes beyond party lines, beyond simple greed. This is about a systemic failure to honor the promises made to those who've served our country." As Daniel began to list names and present evidence, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. Senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats as allies and colleagues were implicated. In the gallery, Sarah Chen furiously took notes, her face a mixture of shock and determination. Halfway through his testimony, the doors at the back of the chamber burst open. A group of men in dark suits entered, flanking a figure Daniel recognized immediately, General William Hawthorne, one of the most decorated military leaders of the past decade. "I'm sorry to interrupt these proceedings," General Hawthorne's voice boomed across the room, "but I cannot sit idly by while these slanderous accusations are made." Senator Cortez stood, her face flushed with anger. "General Hawthorne, this is a closed hearing. You have no authority to—" "I have every authority, Senator," Hawthorne cut her off, striding down the aisle. "Because I'm here to tell you that Mr. Matthews is absolutely right." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Daniel stared at the general in disbelief as he approached the witness table. "Mr. Matthews," Hawthorne said, his voice softer now, "I owe you and every veteran in this country an apology. I've been part of this system, turning a blind eye to the corruption, telling myself it was for the greater good, but no more." The general turned to face the committee, his shoulders squared. "Senators, I am here to corroborate Mr. Matthews' testimony and to add my own. The rot goes deeper than you can imagine, and it's time we cut it out." As General Hawthorne began to speak, detailing years of backroom deals, misappropriated funds, and neglected veterans, Daniel felt a mix of vindication and horror. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. In the gallery, reporters were practically climbing over each other to get out and break the story. Sarah Chen caught Daniel's eye, giving him a nod of respect and determination. This was bigger than either of them had imagined. As the hearing stretched into the night, more whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by Daniel and General Hawthorne's courage. The web of corruption began to unravel, revealing a conspiracy that spanned decades and reached the highest levels of government and industry. By the time the gavel fell to close the session, it was clear that the nation would never be the same. The scandal, quickly dubbed Vetgate by the media, was set to become one of the biggest in American history. As Daniel left the hearing room, exhausted but resolute, he was met by a group of veterans who had been watching the proceedings. One of them, an older man with a Vietnam veteran's cap, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You've done what many of us have been trying to do for years. You've given us a voice." Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As he made his way through the crowded hallways of the Capitol, his phone buzzed with a message from Mike Ramirez. "You did it, Danny. You really did it. We're all proud of you, brother." Outside, a sea of reporters waited, their questions creating a wall of noise. But beyond them, Daniel could see a group of protesters holding signs. "Justice for vets. Hold them accountable. Never forget. Never again." As he stepped into the cool night air, Daniel realized that this was just the beginning. The truth was out. But the real fight, the fight to change the system and make things right, was only just beginning. The nation held its breath, teetering on the brink of a massive upheaval. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Matthews, a man who had gone from homeless veteran to the catalyst for a revolution. The coming days would test not just Daniel, but the very foundations of trust between a nation and those who swore to defend it. The Washington, D.C. courtroom buzzed with tension as Daniel Matthews took the stand. Months had passed since the explosive Senate hearing, and now the first major trial of the Vetgate scandal was underway. In the defendant's chair sat Peter Caldwell, looking pale and drawn in his prison jumpsuit. As Daniel was sworn in, he caught Peter's eye. There was no anger there, just a weary acceptance. Daniel took a deep breath, remembering the journey that had led him to this moment. The prosecuting attorney approached. "Mr. Matthews, please tell the court about your first encounter with Mr. Caldwell." Daniel recounted the night at Le Bernardin, the choking incident, the job offer. As he spoke, he could see the jurors' faces, a mix of sympathy and anger. "And what made you decide to come forward with the information Mr. Caldwell provided you?" the attorney asked. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I realized that staying silent made me complicit. I thought about all my brothers and sisters in arms who were suffering, and I knew I had to speak up, no matter the cost." The cross-examination was brutal. Caldwell's defense team tried to paint Daniel as an opportunist, a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But Daniel held firm, his military training serving him well under pressure. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Veterans who had been wronged, whistleblowers from various implicated companies, and even some of the accused who had turned state's evidence. On the final day of the trial, Peter Caldwell surprised everyone by asking to make a statement. The judge allowed it, and Peter slowly made his way to the stand. "I won't ask for forgiveness," Peter began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I've done is unforgivable, but I want to explain why I finally decided to come clean." The courtroom fell silent as Peter recounted his own journey, from ambitious young businessman to corrupt CEO, and finally to a man crushed by the weight of his own guilt. "When Daniel Matthews saved my life that night, he didn't just stop me from choking. He forced me to confront the person I'd become. I saw in him everything I'd lost: honor, integrity, compassion." Peter turned to face Daniel directly. "Mr. Matthews, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that your actions didn't just expose a scandal. They saved my soul." As Peter was led back to his seat, sobs could be heard throughout the courtroom. The human cost of the scandal was palpable, hanging heavy in the air. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. Peter Caldwell and several other defendants were found guilty on multiple charges. As the sentences were read out, Daniel felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a gnawing uncertainty about what came next. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered. Veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens stood side by side, many holding signs demanding further action and reform. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Daniel, what are your thoughts on the verdict?" Daniel looked into the camera, suddenly aware of the weight of his words. "This is just the beginning," he said firmly. "We've exposed the corruption, but now comes the hard part: fixing a broken system and making sure this never happens again." As he spoke, Daniel noticed a familiar face in the crowd: Mike Ramirez, standing tall and sober, a proud smile on his face. Beside him were other veterans Daniel had met over the course of the trial, men and women whose stories had fueled his determination to see this through. Suddenly, a chant began to ripple through the crowd. "Matthews for Senate! Matthews for Senate!" Daniel's eyes widened in shock. He had never considered entering politics, but as he looked at the faces around him, the hope, the trust, the determination, he realized that his journey was far from over. Senator Cortez appeared at his side, a knowing smile on her face. "They see in you what I saw, Daniel. A leader. Someone who can really make a difference." As the chants grew louder, Daniel felt a familiar sensation, the same mix of fear and resolve he'd experienced before major operations in Afghanistan. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with new battles and unexpected obstacles. But as he stood there, surrounded by those he had fought for, Daniel Matthews made a silent vow. He would continue to serve, to fight for those who had been forgotten, to ensure that the sacrifices made by his fellow veterans were never in vain. The sun was setting over the Capitol dome in the distance as Daniel stepped forward to address the crowd. In that moment, he wasn't just Daniel Matthews, former homeless veteran turned whistleblower. He was the voice of thousands, the bearer of a sacred trust, the symbol of a nation's renewed commitment to its heroes. As he began to speak, the crowd fell silent, ready to hear what this unlikely leader had to say. The next chapter in Daniel's journey, and the nations, was about to begin.
Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.